Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Miller Memorial Lecture of 2024. I am Giulia Cappucci, a PhD candidate in ancient history here at the BCDSS, and today I'm pleased to introduce Professor Matthew Perry. Thank you for being here, Professor Perry. And I'm introducing his talk entitled Gratitude for Freedom, Men, Women, and the Looming Possibility of Re-enslavement. Professor Perry is an associate professor in the classics department at the City University of New York Graduate Center and in the history department at John Jay College. He is a specialist in ancient history, and his research interests encompass Roman social and legal history, in particular issues related to legal status, gender, slavery, manumission, and citizenship. Lately, his research has focused on forms of sexual prohibition and obligation in ancient Rome, resulting in his most recent paper, The Lex Cantinia and the Public Response to Stuprum, which appeared in the 2023 volume of Eugesta, the Journal of Gender Studies in Antiquity. And he is currently working on his monograph, Regulating Sex, Sexual Obligation and Prohibition in Ancient Rome. Just to cite some of Professor Perry's previous works, he contributed the book chapters to the Oxford Handbook for Roman Law and Society, the Oxford Handbook of Greek and Roman Slaveries, and the volume Slavery and Sexuality in Classical Antiquity. His articles appeared in journals such as the Ancient History Bulletin and the Journal of Ancient History. I would also like to mention his 2014 monograph entitled Gender, Manumission, and the Roman Freedwomen, in which he already discussed the themes of gender, slavery, and manumission that also characterize today's lecture. The relevance of Professor Perry's works to the research on asymmetrical dependencies we conduct at the BCDSS is evident, and in particular, his approach to the entangling aspects of manumission and gender in ancient Rome can provide us with new perspectives on the peculiar relationships between liberty, liberte, and their patrons. But now, after this brief introduction, I think it's time to give the floor to Professor Perry. Please, Professor Perry, go on.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the kind introduction and the invitation to present here. So it's a pleasure to be able to join you today. My talk today is going to be focusing on the ancient Roman culture, obviously centered in the city of Rome, but expanding over a wider geographical area, looking roughly at about a 400-year period from 100 BCE to 300 CE. And really, what this presentation is about, or what I'm really kind of interested in looking at here, is how this idea of a debt associated with freed persons, how this was constructed, how this impacted the lives and the freedom of formerly enslaved individuals, and then how this idea of a debt also bolstered the institution of manumission, and then by extension, the institution of slavery in ancient Rome. So the Roman historian Tacitus detailed a debate that took place in the Roman Senate in the year 56 CE during the reign of the Emperor Nero. The question at hand: should an individual who had manumitted an enslaved person, referred to as a patron in Roman society, have the ability to re-enslave the freed person who was not showing him the proper gratitude and respect? The majority of the senators supported this measure, but the deliberative body decided to seek the opinion of the emperor before making a formal pronouncement. Nero, however, hesitated to support the proposal right away and turned to his closest confidants for advice. Their opinions were split. Those in favor of the proposal argued that the insolence of some freedmen had grown to such levels that they acted as if they were the equals of their patrons, mocking their opinions and threatening physical blows. These counselors declared that the existing penalties for such impropriety, fines, exile from the city of Rome, did little to deter inefficacious conduct, making re-enslavement a necessary next step. In the words of Tacitus, this new decree would give patrons a, quote, weapon that could not be spurned, and that freed persons who wished to maintain their freedom would do so, again quoting, through the same compliance by which they had acquired it. The advisors opposing the proposal did not dispute this assessment, agreeing that the behavior of some freed persons warranted this level of retribution. However, they warned that granting patrons a blanket authority to re-enslave their freed persons would create a catastrophic separation between the status of freed and freeborn citizen. The second view prevailed. The emperor withheld his approval, and the measure failed. Nonetheless, Nero allowed re-enslavement to remain a possible punishment for trial cases involving ungrateful freed persons brought before the Roman Senate. The concept of gratitude, or gratia in Latin, and the person of the ungrateful freed person were frequent topics of discussion for moralists, politicians, and jurists in ancient Rome. The philosopher Seneca illustrated the importance of the virtue in the first line of Book 3 of his philosophical essay De Beneficiis, stating that all the peoples of the world know that it is shameful to not offer gratitude after receiving something beneficial. In this sense, the concept of ingratitude relies upon the idea of an unfulfilled transaction, where one individual receives a gift and fails to offer an appropriate response to the benefactor. Roman freed persons received what many ancient authors construed as the ultimate benefit: freedom from enslavement and membership in the citizen community. Accordingly, formerly enslaved individuals were deemed, quote, ungrateful if at any point over the course of their lives they failed to offer appropriate appreciation and dutifulness to their patrons. The debt of the Roman freed person was something that could never be erased. I think that the figure of the ungrateful freed person and the perpetual indebtedness associated with manumission can be very useful for historians examining the institution of slavery in ancient Rome and its seemingly inextricable relationship to Roman citizenship. One of the most important factors for understanding the practice of slavery in the ancient world is the permeability of the line between enslaved and free. Roman law tried to draw a sharp distinction between these statuses, largely due to the classification of enslaved individuals as property owned by another. This division was reinforced in cultural texts that depicted the citizen and the slave as contrasting figures, not only in terms of their legal condition, but also in their character and actions. Indeed, the popular explanation for the elimination of the practice of debt bondage in ancient Rome, where the labor of citizens was held as surety for family debts, was that the practice, with its pronounced power imbalance, could blur the line between free and enslaved. Yet somewhat paradoxically, this line was frequently crossed, often with apparent simplicity and ease. Most significant was the long-standing practice of manumission, whereby an individual freed enslaved peoples under his control. While it is impossible to speak to its frequency, this practice was not uncommon in the Roman world. Both Roman law and literature depict manumission as a widespread and rather mundane occurrence, although it should be noted that only a very small percentage of enslaved individuals likely would have possessed the opportunity or the means to attain freedom. Perhaps even more striking, freed persons of Roman citizens received citizenship themselves, possessing rights and abilities on par with those of most freeborn people. This permeable line was also bidirectional, and it was possible for free Romans to become enslaved themselves. While Roman law prohibited Romans from enslaving their fellow citizens, there was nothing to stop others from enslaving Romans. Defeated soldiers might be enslaved by their enemies, travelers might be captured by pirates and sold into bondage, and so on. While these scenarios would have been highly improbable for the vast majority of Roman citizens, they nonetheless serve to highlight the fact that one's status as free or enslaved was not necessarily static. This brings us back to the figure of the ungrateful freed person and the looming possibility of re-enslavement. According to both custom and law, manumission resulted in a compulsory, lifelong relationship between patrons and their free persons, based on mutual but not equal service and support. Originally, it seems that freed persons were expected to provide open-ended service for their patrons. The orator and philosopher went so far as to describe the lives of the earliest Roman freed persons as a form of continued slavery. A significant turning point occurred in the late 2nd century BCE, when Roman law began to limit patrons' ability to demand labor from formerly enslaved individuals, other than specific obligations contracted at the time of manumission. So Ulpian, a later jurist, commented on this edict, writing that this edict has been put forward by the praetor for the purpose of regulating the gratitude, so there's the word again, which freed persons ought to have for their patrons. For, as Servius writes, in former times, patrons were accustomed to make very harsh demands on their freed persons, naturally, for the purpose of repaying the enormous benefit conferred on freed persons when they are brought out of slavery to Roman citizenship. Ulpian, citing his predecessor Servius, who wrote in the 1st century BCE, characterized manumission as an enormous gift for which patrons sought repayment by making very harsh demands, a phrase that suggests a considerable amount of control over freed persons' labor and lives. The new edict, however, declared that freed persons were only legally liable to provide labor for a set number of days, called operi, established by pledge at the time of manumission. Roman law treated these as voluntary, in quotation marks, as a voluntary obligation, which aspiring freed persons offered in repayment or gratitude for their manumission. So the reason why voluntary is in quotation marks is because owners had no obligation to offer manumission and could simply refuse unless such a satisfactory pledge was made. So in reality, perhaps not so voluntary, but it's the way that it is characterized in Roman law. Over the next decades, Roman lawmakers added even more restrictions on the precise types of financial and trade services that patrons could require from formerly enslaved individuals. They clearly represent an attempt to demarcate the finite obligations of the freed person, promised in exchange for freedom, from the perpetual servitude and indigence of the enslaved. Theoretically, once a freed person completed the established number of operi, he or she fulfilled the obligation to provide labor for his or her patron. At the same time, Romans also believed that freed persons had an enduring obligation to demonstrate obsequium, a general attitude of respect, gratitude, and loyalty to their patrons. In its most basic sense, obsequium meant that freed persons were not to inflict harm upon their patrons or their patrons' families. What constituted harm was left rather open by the jurists. Two of the more common examples were verbal and physical abuse, both of which were mentioned in the senatorial debate described by Tacitus that I began the presentation. One important thing here, Roman law protected all citizens from injury and insult, but it treated a greater range of actions as harm when inflicted upon one's patron. In other words, certain acts accepted as appropriate under normal circumstances were deemed injurious if committed by freed persons toward their patrons. In addition, freed persons could not levy criminal charges against their patrons or initiate any legal action that might bring their patrons shame. The law also forbade freed persons from giving evidence against their patrons, either of their own volition or under the compulsion of the court. Lastly, obsequium required freed persons to aid their patrons in times of need, which included providing financial assistance and serving as a guardian for the patron's children. Both freed men and freed women were subject to the expectations and constraints of obsequium and oberi. However, gendered assumptions about labor and social roles would have shaped specific expressions of these duties. Most illustrative of the significance of obsequium and the debt that it implied was Rome's willingness to punish those freed persons who failed to adhere to its standards. Patrons may have possessed the authority to discipline their freed persons extrajudicially for small matters of undutiful conduct, although no specific details survive here. In more acute cases, patrons had access to the standard legal action for the crime of injuria, the charge covering both physical injury and insult. Indeed, juridical discussions on the law of injuria frequently address confrontations between freed persons and their patrons. Roman law formally distinguished between standard injuria and serious or atrox injuria, with the latter warranting a harsher penalty. Jurists argued that the classification of an act as serious derived not only from the extent of the injury, but also from the context in which it occurred. For example, one declared that an injury becomes more serious if it was inflicted upon a magistrate, parent, or patron. The underlying assumption is that these individuals warranted increased respect, which transformed a lesser offense into something more grievous. In the year 4 CE, approximately 50 years before the senatorial debate discussed at the beginning of the presentation, the Roman people passed the Lex Aelia Sentia. This new law established, among other things, a new ability for patrons, allowing them to bring the formal legal charge of ingratitude against their freed persons. So given the existence of the law of injuria, which would have already covered these type of cases, the creation of a brand new legal action focused solely on the relationship between patrons and their freed persons suggests increased concern. The immediate motivations prompting this legislation are not evident, but several modern scholars have suggested that the political turmoil of the previous century and the growing power of individual freed persons may have exacerbated conflicts. Following the Lex Aelia Sentia, a patron seeking redress for inefficacious conduct would present their case to a magistrate in order to initiate a court trial. The standard penalties for ingratitude included financial reparations in the form of either cash or labor, physical punishment such as flogging or whipping, and exile. The magistrate hearing the case was supposed to assign a punishment appropriate to the severity of the offense. Yet, as the later senatorial debate shows, many, at least among the Roman elite, will come to believe that these penalties did not do enough to deter undesirable behavior, and will argue in favor of re-enslavement as an available punishment. There are a few cases where patrons sought to re-enslave freed persons even before the decision of Nero. Cicero, in a letter to his friend Atticus, announced his plans to return 2 of his freedmen to bondage. Little is known about the first individual, or his purported transgressions against his patron. Other than that, he was some sort of laborer. The second freedman was Chrysippus, a scholar tasked with supporting Cicero's son, but who allegedly abandoned his charge while they were traveling together. Cicero complained that he was willing to ignore minor infractions, such as petty theft, but deemed the freedman's desertion of his son to have been a particularly heinous act. He reported to Atticus his plan to follow the example of a certain Drusus, who had successfully re-enslaved one of his own freedmen. Apparently, Drusus had argued that the individual had never actually been manumitted, since Drusus had freed him while serving as a magistrate, and, acting in his capacity as a magistrate, had been the one to certify the manumission. In other words, Drusus seems to have argued that the original act of manumission was invalid, since the same individual, Drusus himself, could not simultaneously be both the presiding magistrate and the manumitting owner. It is important to note that such a situation would have been possible only for a very small percentage of the Roman elite, and only then sporadically over their political careers when they held annual magistracies. Yet one wonders if some knowingly took advantage of such opportunities, hoping to use the dubious legality to their advantage. Unfortunately, we know little else about the matter apart from the fact that Atticus seems to have endorsed Cicero's plans. After the rise of the Principate, there are cases of emperors using their unique authority to have freed persons returned to bondage. Claudius, who reigned just prior to Nero, supposedly ordered re-enslaved certain freed persons who were, quote, ungrateful, and those about whom patrons issued complaints. Perhaps relatedly, a later jurist commented that Claudius had re-enslaved a freedman because the man had prompted informers to raise questions about his own patron's legal status. Tacitus's account of the senatorial debate in 56 ascribed to the Senate a similar ability to have freed persons re-enslaved when trying cases regarding the purported inefficacious conduct of freed persons. By the late 2nd century CE, re-enslavement appears to have become a standard judicial punishment for freed persons convicted of ingratitude. A constitution attributed to the Emperor Commodus reads, "When it has been proven that patrons have been mistreated due to the insults of their freed persons, or struck by a serious blow, or abandoned while suffering in poverty or sickness, first the freed persons must be returned to their patron's control and compelled to perform service for them as if they were masters. If, however, these freed persons are not admonished by this, then they should be sold to a buyer by the presiding magistrate and the funds given to their patrons." The emperor, in formulating his constitution, drew upon traditional examples of misconduct to identify the ungrateful freed person: disrespectful behavior, physical harm, and a lack of support in times of need. He then outlined a two-step punishment for convicted offenders. First, they were to provide labor for their patrons. Here, the use of the term master or dominus is telling, as it signifies a servile or quasi-servile relationship between two individuals, rather than an arrangement between two citizens. However, this penalty seems to have been something less than full re-enslavement, if only because the law recognized that some individuals might continue to demonstrate inefficacious behavior. These were to be re-enslaved and sold to a new owner. It seems as if the utilization of re-enslavement as a penalty for ungrateful freed persons continued to grow, since a century later, in 294 CE, the Emperor Diocletian felt it necessary to declare that small violations of the standards of obsequium were not enough to warrant a loss of freedom. The implication being that the transgression had to be serious enough to result in re-enslavement. This, however, seems to have been reversed by the next emperor, Constantine, in 320, who ostensibly made re-enslavement a regular punishment for ingratitude, even in cases where the transgression was minor. So I would like to turn now to a particular situation that highlights the perceived indebtedness of freed persons and the constraints of these obligations on their freedom: the marriage between a freed woman and her patron. Roman law encouraged and facilitated such unions by granting exemptions to certain regulations, effectively creating a legal subcategory of manumission for the purpose of marriage. Perceived power differentials, grounded in gender assumptions, underscored Roman attitudes toward marriages between freed persons and their patrons. Both Roman law and social mores strongly discouraged relationships between freed men and female patrons, casting such relationships as unseemly, largely in part because they overturned the perceived power dynamic. The primary exception seems to have been the case where an enslaved woman gained her freedom and then purchased and manumitted her partner. Conversely, it was extremely common to see marriages between male patrons and their freedwomen across a spectrum of statuses. Technically, patrons could not force a freedwoman into marriage. But again, it was well within their power to demand marriage as a requisite for manumission. When a woman was manumitted explicitly for the purpose of marriage, she was to be re-enslaved if she did not complete her marital pledge within 6 months, or if she formed a union with another man. In addition, any freed woman who married her patron needed to obtain his consent in order to divorce and remarry. And this is in comparison to the normal rule of the time, which allowed Roman women to unilaterally initiate divorce. Similarly, several jurists considered whether or not a freed woman could dissolve her marriage with a patron who was being held in captivity, which again would have been standard practice under the law. While opinions here were split, some jurists argued that the marriage should persist, even if, again, the husband was missing in action or held in captivity. And again, the reasoning was the reverence that a freed woman owed to her patron. Roman jurists clearly developed these measures to maintain the existing power dynamic. The underlying anxiety was that an enslaved woman would promise marriage in exchange for her freedom, only to leave her patron husband at the first opportunity. So this then leads us to a particularly fascinating case study. So here we have a funerary altar, a commemorative monument established for a deceased girl, Junia Procula, by her parents. At the bottom, on the front side of the altar, there is an inscription, and you can see it there with the orange arrow. The inscription reads, "To the divine shades of Junia Procula, daughter of Marcus, who lived 8 years, 11 months, and 5 days. She left her wretched father and mother in grief. Marcus Junius Euphrosynes made this altar for himself and for name deleted. Allow the bones of the daughter and the parents to rest in one place. Whatever you have done for us, may you hope for the same for yourself. Believe me, you will be a witness to yourself." So this is a touching statement made by grieving parents honoring their deceased daughter. Unfortunately, something that was all too common in the Roman world. What makes this monument particularly interesting is that at some point, the name of Junia Procula's mother was scratched out, effectively deleted. So here you can see a close-up of the inscription, and the orange box highlights again, where the girl's mother, where her name was erased from the stone. A possible explanation can be found on the back side of the altar, where the following curse was inscribed. Here, the eternal marks of infamy have been written for the freedwoman Acti, a poisoner, and a treacherous, deceitful, and hard-hearted woman. I bring a nail and a rope made of broom, so that she may bind her own neck, and boiling hot pitch to burn her evil heart. Manumitted free of charge, she cheated her patron. Following an adulterer, she stole away his servants, an enslaved girl and boy, while her patron was lying in bed, so that he despaired, an old man left alone and despoiled. And the same marks of infamy to Hymnus and to those who followed Zosimus. Scholars assume that the author of the curse was Marcus Junius Euphorsunus, the father of the deceased Junia Procula, and that Acti was the girl's mother, whose name was deleted from the front side of the monument. It seems likely then that Marcus Junius had manumitted and married Acti, but sometime after the death of their daughter, Acti had departed the union. In the curse, Marcus Junius communicates his feelings of betrayal, describing Acti as treacherous and deceitful, ultimately characterizing her as an insincere and fraudulent poisoner and thief. Of particular note is the inclusion of the word gratis to describe the manumission. I've translated it as free of charge, or one might also say freely given. It is also the same word in Latin, gratia, as the gratitude that a freed person was supposed to demonstrate toward a patron, and what an ungrateful freed person lacked. Dedicators rarely used the phrase manumission gratis in inscriptions, which suggests a deliberateness on the part of Marcus Junius. It highlights both the gift given to Acti and her continued debt to him, a debt that she failed to honor. Marcus Junius, in his eyes, had been cheated. Now, of course, Acti's perspective on the matter, which is unknown, but it most likely would have been quite different. Unable to divorce her patron without his consent, her only option to escape a union that she did not want to be a part of, and to escape patronal authority wielded by her husband, was to flee. Both the obligations imposed upon freed persons under Roman law and the concerns voiced regarding their possible ingratitude speak directly to a perceived debt created by manumission. On its most basic level, this debt was grounded in the economic reasoning of enslavers. Choosing to free an enslaved individual was, from the perspective of Roman authors and lawmakers, ultimately a financial transaction, with the manumitter willingly relinquishing claims to ownership of his or her property. And this idea of a voluntary decision was critical to Roman understandings of the legal relationship between patrons and their freed persons. For example, consider the following declaration by the Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century CE. It is well known that a woman who manumitted a slave on account of a legal trust is later not able to accuse the freedman of ingratitude, since that action is given to an individual who voluntarily bestows freedom freely given upon her slave, not one who makes good an obligation. The emperor's use of the repetitive terms voluntarily and freely given emphasized the intentional decision to manumit made by some owners, compared to the woman who was compelled by law to free an individual in the process of executing a binding trust. By the reasoning of this obscene calculus, Patrons had given their freed persons a tangible gift by transferring to them the value of an enslaved individual. Debt carried with it a moral obligation. The proper response, as the earlier quote from Seneca highlighted, was for the freed person to offer something of equal or greater value in return. Failure to do so indicated a moral deficiency. The Roman author Valerius Maximus calls attention to this ethical element when he recounts the tale of an Athenian who stripped his ungrateful freedman of his freedom. This example almost certainly illustrates the charge of desertion in Athenian law, which could be used against freed persons who did not fulfill certain obligations toward their patrons. However, manumission did not confer citizenship in classical Athens, and the patron's words regarding citizen virtue most likely reference the Roman values of Valerius. The patron says, "I cease to regard you as a citizen, you the undutiful appraiser of so great a gift, and I am not able to be persuaded to believe that you, whom I see to be wicked towards your household, are beneficial to our city. Therefore be gone and be a slave, since you do not know how to be free." The patron asserts that the undutiful freedman did not appreciate the gift bestowed upon him, not only his freedom from bondage, but his citizen status as well. He declares that one who behaves in such a dishonorable way towards his own household, that is, toward his patron, is of no use to the community, and thus is to be returned to servitude. The prevailing view expressed in the ancient sources was that freed persons owed much to their manumitters. Ingratitude was deemed morally problematic because it meant that a sizable debt was not being repaid, and thus the freed person did not truly appreciate the value of the gift received. Furthermore, a lack of appreciation and gratitude was construed as being detrimental to the community as a whole. Thus, the supposed moral failings of a freed person was used to justify not only his loss of citizenship, but also the loss of his freedom. Yet for all the talk of gifts, debts, and moral responsibilities, it is impossible to ignore the anxiety about power dynamics that permeates accounts of ungrateful freed persons. So here again is Tacitus's, or part of Tacitus's account on the debate in the Roman Senate. Tacitus writes that the senators in favor of granting patrons the right of re-enslavement were concerned about these ungrateful freedmen with their mocking and physical threats because they were acting as if they were the equals of their patrons. The current standards of enforcement were not enough, since patrons and freed persons were allegedly on the same judicial footing. Patrons needed a special weapon, a unique weapon, through which the power hierarchy could be maintained. And while this proposal was defeated, ostensibly to protect the citizenship of freed persons, the looming threat of re-enslavement and other penalties for ingratitude remained for those who challenged the power dynamic. In the end, the question at hand was not whether or not such punishment was appropriate, but rather exactly how this punishment was to be wielded and deployed. The perpetual indebtedness associated with freed persons and the gratitude it required highlights a critical tension in Roman custom and law between the protection and exploitation of the formerly enslaved. One of the most consistent trends that we see throughout Roman history is a commitment to the practice of citizen manumission, freeing at least a few enslaved individuals, men and women, granting them citizenship, and protecting their core citizen rights, even at the expense of their patrons' interests. This commitment is clearly present in legal and political discussions regarding the figure of the ungrateful freedperson. Many juridical opinions sought to explain how specific conduct did not, in fact, constitute ingratitude, even if it contravened the desire of patrons. For example, jurists declared that formerly enslaved individuals were allowed to reside wherever they pleased and were permitted to practice the profession of their choice. Similarly, patrons were not allowed to forbid a freedwoman from getting married, that is, unless he had married her himself. All of this suggests that when some patrons attempted to push the boundaries of what obsequium required in order to exert additional control, Roman law attempted to protect free persons' rights. There were also penalties for patrons who attempted to unlawfully re-enslave their freed persons. And of course, the primary motive attributed to the opponents of blanket re-enslavement in the senatorial debate was a concern that such a measure would create two categories of freedom, essentially making freed persons and their descendants true second-class citizens. Moreover, while hierarchical in nature, the obligations of freed persons were not supposed to be inherently servile or degrading, as they closely paralleled those of other Romans. Consider the case of the emancipated child. A Roman father possessed complete financial and legal power over his children so long as he lived, unless he formally released them from this authority. This was known as emancipation. But like freed persons, a formal relationship remained between father and son. And like freed persons, the emancipated son owed his father respect and gratitude for the gift of freedom that he had been given. The jurist Ulpian highlighted the structural similarity between these legal relationships when he wrote that the person of the father and the patron should always be regarded as honorable and sacred to the child and the freed person. As in the case of freed persons, Roman law forbade children from initiating lawsuits for injuria and fraud against their parents. And parents, like patrons, could bring legal charges against their children for disrespectful or negligent behavior, including insult and physical injury. Ulpian also wrote, if a child insults his mother or father, whom he or she is obliged to honor, or lays impious hands upon them, the urban prefect will punish the offense, which pertains to public virtue in proportional measure. The jurists justified punishment on the grounds that ingratitude and disrespect hurt not only the parent, but Roman society writ large. This is quite similar to characterizations of the ungrateful freed person. And by the mid-4th century CE, it was possible to have emancipation revoked and the child returned to paternal power. Respect, devotion, dutifulness were all core virtues in Rome's hierarchical society and define the proper relationship between household members of differing statuses. In this regard, freed persons were not all that different from other Roman citizens. Yet, and a very big yet, despite these conceptual and structural similarities, there were several key distinctions. In practice, the gratitude and respect of the freed person did not look the same as that for children. Jurists clearly distinguished between the two. Moreover, freed person's obligations persisted past the death of his patron, with the debt passing to the patron's heir. Most importantly, the freedom achieved by emancipated child was not the same as freedom from bondage brought by manumission. Accordingly, a return to paternal power was much, much, much less severe and permanent than re-enslavement. Given the stakes of ingratitude, freed persons were not as free as their fellow citizens. According to both Roman custom and law, manumission created a debt for freed persons that could never fully be repaid. In exchange for their freedom and citizenship, freed persons were obliged to demonstrate gratitude, deference, and respect toward their patrons in all facets of their lives. Those who failed to meet these standards were liable to punishment, including re-enslavement. Evidence from legal sources demonstrates how this indebtedness permeated and shaped freed persons' legal status and rights as citizens, and alludes to the various ways that formerly enslaved individuals may have experienced these obligations, although it is difficult, if not impossible, to speak to individual realities, which must have been quite varied. The constraints on a freed person's liberty due to their assumed indebtedness are perhaps most apparent in the marriages between freed women and their patron. A freed woman manumitted for the purpose of marriage, or simply one who had chosen to marry her patron, faced substantial restrictions to not only her freedom in general, but also to her social and economic abilities as a Roman citizen. We have few concrete details about the application of these rules in Roman society. It is impossible to speak to the number of cases for ingratitude brought against freed persons, or how often penalties such as re-enslavement were imposed. What is clear is that for centuries, Roman authorities believed this was an important topic worthy of extensive attention and discussion. Two things stand out to me about how the indebtedness of freed persons was constructed and maintained within these discussions. The first is a willingness to limit the exploitative power of patrons in order to protect freed persons' abilities to live as Roman citizens. The second is the propagation of the hierarchical relationship between patron and freedman. While at times these two goals may have been at odds with one another, they were both critical to the value ascribed to manumission in Roman society. Manumission was an integral part of the centuries-long institution of Roman slavery, serving as an incentive for good conduct and as a means for bolstering a patron's political and economic power through freed persons' work as agents, business partners, and spouses. Yet for the latter to function as intended, both the freed person's citizen status and the patron-freed person power hierarchy needed to be maintained. The debt assigned to the Roman freed person served both of these purposes, maintaining the pre-existing dynamic in a decidedly citizen-like manner. The amount of attention dedicated to the figure of the ungrateful freed person suggests just how important this hierarchy was to many Romans. Freed persons who failed to recognize their debt threatened the desired power dynamic, and according to the espoused tenets of Roman society, needed to be corrected and, if necessary, returned to bondage. This sentiment does not appear to have been contested among Roman authorities. However, in the interest of preserving the delicate balance between exploitation and protection that govern the lives of freed persons, extreme penalties such as re-enslavement needed to be applied judiciously. It is to this end that authorities seemingly rejected re-enslavement as a blanket power granted to patrons, and instead committed the punishment of ungrateful freed persons to state authorities. The permeable boundary between free and enslaved in the ancient world meant that freedom was never guaranteed. But the debt resulting from manumission and the looming possibility of re-enslavement meant that the freedom of Roman freed persons was a little less free and a little less secure. Thank you.